What's going on, A-Push Nation? This is Mr. Majewski. It is 2018 and we are on spring break, which means I am putting together a video for you that is covering the New Deal. Now, before we get started on the New Deal, it dawns on me that there are a few things that I want to hit on really fast before we get to the New Deal from both the 1920s society and 1920s politics notes. So you need to have both of those notes out from earlier, before the New Deal, and I'm going to actually start with those. So I'm going to give you a moment, and you should pause the video and go ahead and get those out right now, because I'm going to start right with 1920 society, and I'll tell you right away where we're at when you come back. So get those notes out for me, all right, and I'll be right here. Okay, here we go. 1920 society. I want you to go all the way to the back of the 1920 society to the Harlem Renaissance page. We've already kind of hit on the Harlem Renaissance very briefly, but I did want to talk about it, and more importantly, I want to talk about a guy named Marcus Garvey who comes as a result of it. So the Harlem Renaissance, remember, is this emergence of African-American poetry and literature and art and music. It really centered around Harlem, New York, which was a mostly African-American neighborhood. It was a neighborhood that had grown because of the Great Migration, which had occurred during World War I, where African Americans had come up from the South. The focus of the work oftentimes was on African American kind of expression, self-expression. They oftentimes talked about the pain, the sorrow, the discrimination they were experiencing. They also talked about empowerment and finding success amidst all the obstacles. Anyways, incredible source of artists. Some of the poets and writers, Langston Hughes, very famous, Mr. M's favorite poet of American history. Claude McKay, Countee Cullen, Zora Neale Thurston, all of these people are writers and poets from that era. Duke Ellington is the famous musician, along with Louis Armstrong. Both of these guys are the famous concert musicians, composers. They really use jazz to express their feelings and really express African-American culture. Remember, they operated out of the Cotton Club, the famous jazz club located in New York. Okay, so you do need to be aware of this person. So we already know about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Those are our two African-American civil rights leaders, right? Remember, Washington talked about accommodation, that he'd take segregation in exchange for jobs and education. And remember, the other civil rights leader, W.E.B. Du Bois, criticized Washington for that. Kind of called him a traitor because he said, how can you accept segregation and social separation? How can you accept Jim Crow? We should have absolute equality. And remember, he talked about the talented 10th should have it right away. Anyways, those were the two famous civil rights leaders. But there was a third. This is the much more militant, the much more aggressive, the much more not willing to wait or work with white society. His name is Marcus Garvey, and he was inspired by and also a part of the Harlem Renaissance. And he was part of the United Negro Improvement Association. Now remember, Du Bois founded the Niagara Movement, which became the NAACP. That was like the more peaceful version of African-American civil rights. This, the UNIA, was the more militant. First, Garvey advocated a Back to Africa movement, where he actually said African Americans should move back to Africa, that you'll never be able to coexist with white society after they've made you slaves and then treated you with discrimination for so long. Even if you get equality from them, it'll never be absolute equality, he said. So you should just move. There's no hope of ever being able to coexist with one another. Eventually, when he realized that message wasn't popular with people, they did not want to leave. Sorry, geez. Then he kind of changed his message, and he started talking more about, okay, we need to focus on black pride and separatism. So what he said was blacks should live in the United States, but they should live in separate black communities. And they should shop at black stores and only go to other black businesses that are operated by other blacks. And they should essentially almost live as a separate society within the United States. Anyways, he's really unique and he's really much more radical. He says really more radical and violent things. Now, hey, just like W.E.B. Du Bois, influenced Martin Luther King in terms of like more peaceful resistance, Marcus Garvey's the guy that's going to inspire Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, who are much more radical and much more violent in their demands. Anyways, make sure you know who that is. Hey, that's an example of like a critic or somebody who was not maybe as positively influenced by the Roaring Twenties as the rest of society was. There were these other critics you need to be aware of, the Lost Generation. During the 1920s, the most famous group of American writers ever emerged. You're reading about some of them in some of your classes, right? If you've read F. Scott Fitzgerald, he's one of them. Ernest Hemingway's another one. Anyways, these were guys who started writing after World War I. They were strongly affected by what had happened in the war. They called them the Lost Generation because they were mostly male writers, and that male generation had been wiped out pretty much by the war. So there was like this huge missing generation of men in society, especially in Europe. And so it was kind of a pessimistic time for the young people. They had felt like there were a lot of promises by Wilson and others that had never been achieved. So it was kind of a pessimistic, critical time. Some of them criticized the incredible wealth that people were accruing. Some of them made fun of it and the fact that they were flaunting their wealth. A lot of these writers kind of felt like the wealth and the other stuff was fake, and we were pursuing the wrong things in our obsession with buying and consuming products. Anyways, really criticized that materialism. So H.L. Mencken, famous one, he kind of writes a series of short stories criticizing conservative society. F. Scott Fitzgerald, you should know, he criticizes the wealth and especially the nouveau rich that emerged in society and flaunted that wealth. Ernest Hemingway, Farewell to Arms, is a book about the war and kind of the false promises of the war. Sinclair Lewis wrote a few famous books where he criticized and made fun of like Midwestern conformity and their obsession with buying little gadgets like alarm clocks. His two most famous books, Main Street and Babbitt. Anyways, you should just be aware that those guys were kind of critical, and there were some critics of the 1920s, even while most of society was kind of awash in the enjoyment of it. All right, let's jump over to 1920s politics. Now, I have a video on this that I'd highly recommend you watch, all right? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to fly through and hit on a few key points. All right, so the 1920s was a period where Republican presidents dominated, and they were very conservative. Think William McKinley. So even though we had progressives like Roosevelt and Wilson, they go away and they're replaced by conservatives again. And they go right back to the policies that McKinley and the Gilded Age presidents used that made business boom and made business thrive. Came at a price. It helped cause the Depression at the end of the decade. Okay, so again, remember, it's Warren Harding. He's your first president of the 1920s, very conservative. Supported by old guard conservatives. Remember, Harding promised normalcy after World War I. He was elected. There he is. As you can see, I'm moving forward. If you want to see the full story, watch the full video. You should do it. I'm going to jump over some of this. Like I said, the old guard cabinet of Harding's dominated. And it was very much like William McKinley. So think of it as old guard, pro-business, always favor business and corporations at all costs. No regulation at all, so businesses can kind of get away with cheating and merging and forming monopolies. And he was a very conservative president. All of these presidents of this era, all three of them, back to back to back, followed the same setup. All right, so first one is they believed that the purpose of government is to make business profitable. So they're big laissez-faire guys, right? They're big what's called believers in trickle-down theory. Trickle-down theory says you give tax cuts to corporations and to the wealthy. Since they're the one who have all the jobs, when they benefit, they hire more workers, they build on their factories, they need more workers, there's more construction jobs, there's all of those things. So we should give tax cuts to them, because when they benefit, the rest of society does, because the wealth trickles down to the rest of us. This is what these conservative politicians of the 20s believed. This is also what McKinley believed. Now, these guys also happen to be businessmen who were benefiting the most a lot of times from these policies. Anyways. So most of the burden, so the middle class started to have to pay a majority of the taxes now because the upper and really rich got such big tax benefits. By the way, this is the same policy that President Trump did with his recent tax cuts. The businesses, the corporations, all got the biggest cuts because his idea is, hey, trickle-down theory works. Remember, he's very wealthy as well. That was one of the criticisms of his decision. Anyways, let me jump ahead. We're also going to massively raise the tariff. In doing so, we're going to protect American businesses. Oh, by the way, I'm sure you saw what President Trump did recently, right? You're going to notice that the tariff in the 1920s is going to start to skyrocket. It's going to go way up, and it's going to continue to go up even through the Great Depression. So we're going to protect American businesses at all costs. Very famous cartoon. You got to watch that on the big video. All right. Government, laissez-faire, stay out of business, don't regulate them, let them merge, let them get away with breaking regulations, no regulations. Put people in charge who will not regulate the businesses they're supposed to, so that the government technically isn't doing its regulation job, just so businesses can grow. And that's what they did. They allowed monopolies to form. They didn't regulate. By the way, the Supreme Court was very conservative, so they favored business as well. They overturned laws protecting workers, minimum wages, maximum work hours. Those laws got overturned. Child labor overturned because very conservative court as well. So again, super great time for business, really bad time for union. Not only is the government and courts working against unions, businesses, remember, were using that welfare capitalism, and so unions could not match the prosperity. Also, hey, conservatives believe in reducing debt, or at least reducing the size of government, so government's doesn't have much control over people's lives. And one of the ways to do that is to defund parts of the government. So when you make the government smaller, you actually can increase the debt, right? Because what you're doing there is you're still paying long story short, they tried to reduce the size of the government. They actually they did reduce the debt basically from about 26 to 16 billion because certain parts of the government, like workers, were operating with less workers in certain departments than before. So again, long story short here, conservatives believe in making government smaller, taxing less, regulating less, all to help businesses, which helps the rest of us. And ultimately, their attitude is when we all benefit, we all start making more money along with businesses, we have to pay higher taxes back to the government, so the government ends up benefiting too. So ultimately, the government should help business because ultimately everybody, including the government, benefits directly when business does. Anyways, next president, Coolidge, guy that took over for Harding. Harding died, and Coolidge took over. Again, very popular. How couldn't you be, right? Really just continued exactly what Harding had started, and he promised he'd do that, and that's exactly what he did. High tariffs, anti-union, laissez-faire, trickle-down. We already talked about all those. Herbert Hoover takes over for Coolidge. He was very popular for helping during the war, and also World War I, and also he had been in Harding's cabinet. He rolls to the victory. Look at that win right there, guys. Dang. And, and then we get to the crash, and I kind of talked a little bit about the crash in class in the little time that I had. But again, when the market is running forward and charging forward, it's called a bull market. That means that it's doing well. It had been a bull market throughout most of the 20s because the economy seemed like it was going so well. A lot of people were buying money and putting it into the stock market, which was actually good for all stocks because the more money that goes into the market, it's like the more confidence people have in business. And so that was causing the value of stocks to go up, so more and more people were putting money in. A lot of folks were borrowing money. It's called buying on margin. They were buying stock on credit, believing that they could pay off the debt with the profit they would make. And the reality was the market was overspeculated. There was way too much money in it, and people were investing blindly in companies, believing they were going to meet these ridiculous gains and goals and continue to prosper. And eventually, quite frankly, they made too much stuff, and people borrowed so much they couldn't borrow anymore, they couldn't buy any more goods, and we had this massive oversupply of all of these products, and it led to this depression. So anyways, the crash happens in October 1929. It's massive drops in the value of the stock market. People who invested in it lost their life savings. There's the panic, the run to the Wall Street, to the stock market the day that it happened. People rushing there, trying to figure out what's happening, see if they can get any money. Most couldn't. The market crash is kind of considered the unofficial start of the Depression. There it was when it happened. Look what happens to the value of the market. It goes way down as time goes by. Why? Like I mentioned, despite people investing in the market, there were all these signs that the market was bad. Cotton, railroad, coal, all of those industries were struggling by the end of the 1920s. Farmers were taking it hard as well. We were overproducing way too many goods and underconsuming because we ran out of credit. So again, we have certain industries doing poorly. We have way too many goods on the market. We don't have enough buyers. We don't have enough money to buy it. And so it all just caught up with us together. Also, by the end of the 20s, the super rich had almost all the wealth in this country, or a huge amount of it, while a huge chunk of the public was actually really poor. And the banks were bad. Banks were unreliable. They were kind of giving loans out badly. They were risky. They were gambling with people's money. And so it led to a lot of runs on banks. And so when one bank collapsed, it oftentimes led to others because they were so dependent on each other and they were all engaged in such risky behavior. There's that bank run right there. Anyways, the Great Depression hits, right? And when it hits, it's brutal. 23% of banks failed. You should watch the video. It'll tell you all the details, but it was horrible. Look at these declines. I really do a good job in the video. Please watch it. It's only a short amount. But anyways, yeah. Look at that. Look at the drop-off in the economy. It was unemployment goes to 25%. So like the crash hits, the economy starts to lag. All these problems affect us at the same time, and we couldn't get out of it. And everything we tried that had worked previously to get us out of panics didn't seem to work. And so, it was crazy. Banks failed. 20% of banks, 1 out of every 5 banks failed with everybody's money in it. And your money was gone when the bank failed still. A lot of those banks had invested in the stock market, and so they crashed as well. So again, we lost 20% of our banks in 1 year, or by 1932, and then we lost another 4,000 after that. So it was crazy. When banks failed, businesses failed because they couldn't get loans. So over 50,000 businesses in just 2 years. Or I should say by 1932. It was crazy. Business investment was down. Nobody was investing in businesses because why would you invest your money, what little you had, in businesses that were failing everywhere? Nobody has money. Nobody's buying. Businesses shutting down. Banks closing down. Our GDP goes way down, which means we're not producing anything anymore. Look at our business cycle compared to the previous ones. Look at that. It's so far off the charts. It's absurd. Unemployment, because all of those businesses fail. That means all those workers get fired or laid off. So it reached 25%. Think about that. 1 out of 4 people is unemployed. Today, the unemployment rate is 4%. When it's bad, it's at 8 or 9%. Here, it's at 25%. If you included farmers, it was 33%. In some places, it was 50%, with the worst, most vulnerable workers, like the unskilled workers. So it was crazy. Look at unemployment. It skyrockets. Everything's going terrible all at the same time. It's bad news. Wages dropped by 40%. So doing the same work, you were making 40% the amount of money you had been before. 1 out of every 4 farms failed, lost their farms. So every time this happens, just craziness. Humans are suffering. Everybody loses their self-worth. Marriages are breaking up. Nobody's getting married anymore. Everybody's getting divorced if they can. Dads are leaving their families because they feel like they can't provide for them. Nobody's having kids because who in the world would have kids in a depression? You have 3 million people that are homeless that are living in these shanty towns all over the country. They nickname them Hoovervilles to criticize the president. Who gets blamed? We have malnutrition everywhere. We have people dying of starvation on the streets. Famous pictures here by a famous photographer, Dorothea Lange. Yeah, look at those. Just crazy. Look at this. Look at the emaciation on these people's faces. Crazy. Jobless men, keep going. We can't take care of our own. We don't need any more homeless people. Just keep going. It was the worst depression in history. We're going to do something called the New Deal to try to get out of it. Really, we needed World War II, and it's not until World War II when we start to prepare for it that we're finally able to get out of it. By the way, look at the Hoovervilles. Look at that one. They're huge. They're everywhere. It's like Santa Ana River Trail, but imagine them everywhere. Santa Ana River Trail was huge. It was very large, that's it's really sad. But imagine if they were everywhere, all over, including Central Park, the famous park in the middle of New York City. The problem with Hoover is he's viewed as not doing enough. He doesn't respond very quickly, and when he does, it's viewed as not doing enough. He blamed international community when it was really us. He blamed the rest of the world's economies. He didn't do a ton. He finally did try to help the farmers, but it wasn't enough. He encouraged people to volunteer and to sacrifice and go without. That's the last thing people wanted to hear. And so he was seen as uncaring. He was seen as aloof. He was seen as somebody completely out of touch with the misery that was going on. On top of that, he led Congress to raise the tariff to the highest ever possible. That was the worst thing that could happen because it slowed down the recovery. Eventually, he did sign into law some infrastructure projects to try to put people back to work. The most famous was the Hoover Dam project that built the Hoover Dam, named after him, but it really wasn't enough. He did also pass something called the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. The government was going to loan out hundreds of millions of dollars. But unfortunately, it wasn't really going to help people who needed it desperately to survive. It went to businesses and banks. And so again, it felt like the president was really helping businesses and his buddies instead of helping the people who were struggling mightily. Anyways, the most famous example of criticism of Hoover was something called the Bonus Army. About 14,000 veterans marched on Washington, frustrated with the lack of support from the government. They wanted bonuses that had been promised to them given to them early. Instead, Hoover called in the military. These people brought their families with them. It made Hoover look really terrible when the military stepped in and got into kind of fighting with these guys. Eventually, he tried. He did what he could, but he was really conservative, and he didn't really believe in assistance to people in need. He believed that people had to help themselves, and government's job was to help business and not to help individual people. So ultimately, seen as uncaring, but really just caught up in the mistakes of his predecessors' policies that he continued, thinking that this prosperity would last forever. Anyways, let's get to the real deal of this, the New Deal, and we're going to roll through our New Deal, people, although obviously we're going to take this one a little slower, since this one's actually the intention of the video. Okay, so now we get to the actual topic at hand here, and it was important that we go through those at least a little bit and set things up, because you could get a lot of questions about those, and it's a key part of the 1920s. But here we are into the New Deal. All right, the New Deal is the name we call Franklin D. Roosevelt's plan to try to get the country out of the Depression. Remember, Hoover had been the president during the Depression. He had really felt the effects of it. He's incredibly unpopular, and he's seen as uncaring. And Roosevelt realized, hey, we need policies that are going to put people back to work. You're going to make people start to have confidence in the government again, and get people, businesses going and banks going and people working again. And if the government has to pay or go into debt in order to do that, he said, that's what we're going to do. That was very different than Hoover, who was really kind of slow to react, as opposed to Roosevelt's very aggressive approach to basically trying to kick-start the economy again using the government. Anyways, let's get to it. New Deal tackled the Great Depression with massive federal programs designed to bring about three things, the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Okay, Franklin Roosevelt, he was born in New York. He was in a wealthy family. He had been part of the Navy. He was a part of the government in charge of the Navy during World War I. He was the vice presidential nominee in 1920. They lost. He got polio in 1921, so he was in a wheelchair. and could only stand or walk for very short distances. However, the public didn't really know about that. The media kind of helped to hide that from the public. They didn't want the president to be viewed as weak or sick. Anyways, he was governor of New York in 1928 and 1930. So while Hoover's unpopularity was getting worse, he was getting a lot of attention for being very aggressive and doing a lot of these programs that he's going to do for the country at the state level in New York. And they were successful and popular. He was a really, really good politician. He was really big on compromise. Here's a rare picture of him in the wheelchair. He didn't usually get taken in a wheelchair. What would happen is the public would see images instead of him standing and throwing a ball. Oftentimes he would take pictures where he was sitting in a car as if he was being driven around and it just stopped to take the interview, not realizing, the public not realizing that he really was doing it to hide the fact that he couldn't really walk. Anyways, Eleanor Roosevelt was his wife. She's considered by many to be the most famous. She was the niece of Theodore. She was a fourth cousin of FDR. So, guys, that's kind of crazy far. So I know it sounds crazy to think they were cousins, but it's not as creepy as one might think. She kept his political career alive in the 20s when he had polio. She really kind of continued to keep him continuing on to continue to pursue that career. She ended up being a major advisor of his and a close confidant. He called her the conscience of the New Deal because she often spoke out on behalf of women and people of color, the poor, children. She was really an advocate for all of those people. She was much more active than any first lady up to this point. She actually sat in on some of his meetings. Anyways, in 1932, he gets nominated for president by the Democrats, promised the country a new deal for the American people. Basically, that new deal is to get them out of this old deal that they are in with Hoover. Now, remember, it's also a play on Theodore Roosevelt's square deal that he had promised for the country. So he's trying to kind of revive that Roosevelt, I'll fix the problem message. He kind of was a little vague during the campaign, but that doesn't matter because I think he just was really optimistic and hopeful and promised he'd do a lot to help those in need. Meanwhile, the Republicans renominated Hoover. Not a smart move, not popular. He really just promised, hey, we're going to keep the tariff high. We're going to try to help businesses. People need to try to conserve and sacrifice and help one another and volunteer and look to charities for assistance. He seemed kind of defensive. Roosevelt seemed optimistic. Look at what this presidential outcome was. Yep, that's what happens when you run during the Depression as the president. You get clobbered. Anyways, the big switch here was African Americans. They jumped ship for the first time. They started voting Democrat for the first time because of Roosevelt's message and because of Eleanor. So when that happens, Democrats start to get a huge boost in elections. You'll also slowly start to see whites in the South flee the Democratic Party and begin to slowly move towards the Republicans, starting in the 1940s. During the lame duck. Okay, so FDR wins. Remember, he's got to wait months to take over as president. That period where the old president is waiting to end, he's already been voted out or he's done. It's called the lame duck period for the president that's still in charge. So normally nothing gets done then. Congress waits for the new president and no laws are passed or anything like that. Well, because we were in the Depression, a lot of folks were like, this sucks. Why do we have to wait 5 months for the new president to take over? That's too long. So we passed the 21st Amendment during that period while we were waiting. That, of course, ended Prohibition. That was important. Roosevelt supported it, said people want to drink, especially during these tough times. Also, we passed the 20th Amendment, which reduced that lame duck period and really only made it 6 weeks, or actually about 5 or 6 weeks before the new president takes over. So to reduce the time before the new guy takes over after he wins the election. Anyways, that was the drive to be inaugurated by Roosevelt. The tradition is that the old president and the new president ride together. The meeting was cold. They didn't speak to each other. They did not care for each other one bit. There's FDR. Number 2 on the list, historians, political scientists view him as one of the masters. Remember the effects of the Depression from the previous unit. Look at that. 25%, 33% unemployment. 25% of banks have failed. 25% of farms have failed. Thousands of businesses have failed. Tens of thousands, actually. So we're in the worst of it when he takes over. We need a miracle. And he talks about, hey, in his inaugural address, a lot of fire, a lot of positivity, a lot of optimism. The famous statement, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He believes that he and the government have the solutions to these problems if the government will trust him and it. This is his plan. They're known as the 3 R's. He says, hey, we need relief, we need recovery, and we need reform programs. And what he said was, we need different types of programs to do different things to fix the problems that we have. First, he said, we need relief programs. Relief programs are short-term fixes to solve the problems people are struggling from right now, the immediate problem. So what's causing the bleeding, for instance? So, for instance, these are programs that are short-term that are going to put people back to work immediately. These are programs that are going to keep them in their homes and in their farms immediately. These are programs that are going to, help banks out immediately and keep them open and keep them functioning so that so the bleeding will stop and the damage will not get worse. So the unemployment rate will stop getting worse and things like that. Then, once we've achieved that, we're going to go to recovery programs, and those are kind of medium-term programs after the short ones have started to work. And those are going to get us back to where the economy was before the Great Depression hit. So these are more significant, and these are going to solve some of the larger problems that have contributed to this depression happening and making it so bad this time around. Then, finally, once we've achieved that, we're going to do the big long-term reform programs. These are major reforms and changes to our system that we might keep indefinitely. Many of these we still have today. And these are going to prevent us from ever having another Great Depression again. That's the goal, is to prevent us from ever having a depression that affects us like this one. Yes, we'll have tough times, but hopefully there'll never be anything like this one again. So these are going to be reforms to things to our Federal Reserve System, to our banking system, and to our entire economic system to fix a lot of our problems. Anyways, that's the plan. And it works pretty decently. Okay, well, you can be the judge of how well it works, actually, because one could say it worked and one could easily argue it didn't work that well. Anyways, what Roosevelt does right when he takes over as president after his inaugural address is he surrounds himself with a group of incredible advisors. He called them the Brain Trust, his inner circle of advisors. They were some of the smartest businessmen, politicians in the country. Names that you should know: Frances Perkins, you might remember her. She's the first female cabinet member. She was a famous female progressive. Harry Hopkins, if you remember, he had been in charge of government administrations during World War I. Harold Ickes, Cordell Hull, and Eleanor, all of these were part of the Brain Trust. So here we go. You can see FDR leading the donkey, which is a symbol of the Democratic Party, and you see how it's pulling the cart. The cart represents Congress, which is really kind of like pulling the entire country. So Roosevelt's got the donkey by the leash, which is pulling Congress and the country along. And you'll see, where are they on the path to? They're on the path to emergency legislation to fix the country's problems. So you see how FDR is smiling, and he knows the way, and he's leading us. Looks as if this new leadership was really going to lead, right? Is like what the public's thinking to themselves. So obviously the message here, look at FDR and what he's doing. The cartoonist supports his aggressive approach to try to fix the problems compared to the old administration, which was viewed as slow to react. Anyways, the first 3 months of FDR's presidency are called the first 100 days. During that time, he is basically allowed to pursue whatever policies he wants. The country is so desperate that Congress gives him the unprecedented privilege of being able to really pass whatever he wanted to, and Congress would pass it to try to fix the problems. So anyways, This was this incredibly aggressive series of laws he got passed. And it made him seem super, super responsive and aggressive. And looked like the public really gets behind him because look at what he's doing to try to fix this. Even if these don't work, at least he's trying, right? And it gives him this kind of sense of, oh, he's one of our guys. Anyways, he also, during this time, he communicates really effectively with the public. He uses radio to speak to them in what are called fireside chats. And he says, hey, I'm speaking to you directly from, in front of the fireplace at the White House to tell you what I'm doing to fix the problems and why you should have faith in our country and in our economy and in our government. And the people love it. They feel like the president's actually communicating with them. And he starts to restore faith in the country's economy again. Anyways, I already mentioned each of these programs. Short-range goals are relief. Medium-range goals are usually recovery. And then the long-range ones are reforms. A lot of these are ideas that were inspired by the progressives from long ago. So kind of a Roosevelt to Roosevelt connection. Anyways, like we said, first 100 days, this incredible period of legislation that gets passed, one of the most aggressive periods in history. He's able to really get whatever he wants passed. You should know that they sometimes divide his policies up into the first and second New Deal, just to divide them up by years because so much gets passed. It's easier to separate them in half. Anyways, first thing he does, try to respond to that banking crisis. We have these runs that are occurring on banks everywhere, right? When banks, run out of money, people rush there, everybody loses everything, causes panics, causes other runs to other banks, causes banks to lose money who had borrowed and loaned to each other. So it's like a snowball effect. They're terrible. And people lose confidence in banks. They don't deposit money in the banks anymore. Even good banks lose their depositors. So this is devastating to an economy, especially a modern economy, and it was crippling the American economy. Remember, when banks close down, businesses can't get loans, individuals can't get loans, so people lose their houses, they lose their farms, they lose their businesses. Anyways, this is a really famous cartoon, and it's a great one. Here's a guy who's lost everything. He's kind of homeless, sitting on a bench. He's a victim of one of these bank failures, right? And the squirrel is like lecturing him, hey, but why didn't you save the money for the future when times were good? Squirrels are known for like saving up for the winter, saving nuts up for the winter so they have a stash, a stockpile. And the guy's like, hey, I did, right? And the message is like, he did what he was supposed to do, right? He did what every American is supposed to do. He deposited his money in his bank, and he expected it to be safe like it's supposed to be, and he's been screwed, and he's been jacked. And this isn't right, and this isn't fair. Anyways. So what FDR does is the first thing he did is he declared a banking holiday. So for a week in 1933, after he takes over, he basically says, hey, every bank in this country is closed. And then federal inspectors go into every bank. And they would only allow banks that were solvent, which meant they had enough money in their vaults to be able to pay off all their debts. They were the only ones that were allowed to reopen. And then he basically went in a fireside chat and he told the people, hey, I'm only allowing the good banks to open. So if your bank is open, you can trust it and you can have faith in it and you can deposit money in there and not have to worry. So again, all of this is designed to restore faith in the banking system so people will start putting their money back in it again instead of keeping it at home where it can't be used to support the country's economy. He also took us off the gold standard temporarily. He thought that would somehow trigger some inflation growth. He also passed something called the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which, again, the government opened good, which were called sound banks, which had the money to pay off their debts. And they merged weak ones, which didn't, or they liquidated them, which means they closed them, and sold them to bigger, larger sound banks. So again, the government basically took over the banking industry, and they allowed the good banks to continue to operate. And then the bad banks, they either closed, they merged until they were good banks, or they sold parts of those banks to the good ones and made them larger. Again, all of this is designed to restore the public's faith, Again, FDR communicates really effectively in these fireside chat radio addresses and convinces the public to start putting that money back in, and immediately it starts to happen. In addition to that, FDR was able to get the HOLC passed, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. 1 million people were able to refinance their mortgages on their homes. They were about to lose their homes. They were able to renegotiate, get really low interest rates. That allowed them to stay in their homes. And so banks did not foreclose as much, which means more people did not lose their homes, which means homelessness is going to be tackled by this. Many of these folks are middle class, or soon will be, and of course that loyalty to the Democratic Party starts to grow, to FDR and to the Democrats. In addition, the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, so important. And again, all of these would be considered reforms for the most part. All of these would be considered relief for the most part. What the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act did, although this one isn't actually, this one's more of a reform, is it created something called the FDIC in the government. And if next time you go into a bank, look for it. It'll be in there. It'll say we're a member of the FDIC. If you're in a credit union, it's a different acronym, but you have the same protection. And what it said was, hey, from now on, the government's going to insure or back up deposits in a bank. So if a bank has your money and it closes for whatever reason, or it gets robbed or something happens to your money, the government steps in and says, up to a certain amount, we will insure it, which means you'll get your money back. It's almost like, hey, we want you to have faith in banks in our country, and so therefore if anything ever happens, you'll get your money back. Now, originally the maximum amount was $5,000. Today, I believe the max amount is $250,000. Anyways, bank failures, as you can see, as a result of these acts, look at this. This is before the Depression, right? This is when the Depression happens. Look at this. Boom, boom. FDR takes over in 33 after this. Look at that. Oh no, right? And then boom. Look at what these banking reforms do. Between the Emergency Banking Reform Act, right, and the Glass-Steagall Act, between those things and the banking holiday, he's able to really fix this banking crisis, not only in the short term but also the long term as well. And of course, here you go, right? Look at it. He calls it a New Deal. And so in this instance, Uncle Sam has a deck of cards in his hand, or he has a hand in his hand, and he's saying to himself, it is a New Deal. Look at it. I have all aces, and each of those aces is supposed to reflect one of the achievements that Roosevelt has made since he's become president. So another really positive, really friendly message about what Roosevelt has done. In addition to that, hey, we want to regulate these banks and these businesses to make sure that we don't have another stock market crash, or at least if we do, hopefully we have made it as small as possible. So the market up to this point was not regulated, which means the government did not have any inspectors or regulators to make sure that cheating and lying and deception were not going on, and fraud wasn't going on. So we create one. It's called the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And it's designed to protect the public and investigate the stock market and banks to look out for fraud, deception, and manipulation of the market for individual gain. So now we're going to try to better regulate the market as well to avoid these problems in the future. Okay, now that we've hopefully fixed banks and we've helped some homeowners out, right, to stay in their homes to try to affect the homelessness issue, and now that we're better regulating the stock market with the SEC, now we need to put people back to work, FDR says. So, how are we going to do that? Well, a number of different programs. Most famous is the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Folks, this is still around today. It's really the most popular of its programs. What it does is it employs almost 3 million young boys and men, usually 18 to 24. They worked in outdoor camps. They were usually run by the military. And they would do outdoor projects, reforestation, firefighting, flood control, whatever outdoor projects we needed, swamp drainage. They got paid a small wage by the government. Usually their costs were paid for by the government, like a military style kind of setup, and then their wages usually went back home to their families. So again, it was wildly successful. You got to live and work out in the open environment. You had a job provided for you by the government when there were none back at home. It put 3 million young men to work for varying times. The next time you're out in a national park, anywhere, look around. You'll see CCC built things everywhere from this era. It's pretty awesome to see history in action there everywhere you go. Also, another jobs program was called the FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Association. It was run by Harry Hopkins, really famous government administrator. $3 billion provided by the federal government given to states if a state had any project it needed to be built, like road projects or bridges or railroads, but it couldn't afford it. The federal government basically gave it the money. The government borrowed money, went into debt, in order to give the states money to put people back to work in order to make these projects built. So again, $3 billion just distributed to the states. It was called direct dole payments, which meant like direct money to the states. People got paid directly by the federal government in order to work. There was another program called the Civil Works Administration. Again, 4 million unemployed workers, mostly small tasks. This was mostly in the city. A lot of these were kind of what were considered somewhat useless tasks, like raking leaves and things like that. But the whole goal here was, even if they only worked a little bit, put them back to work, have them make money again, have them start to earn a little bit of self-respect, maybe start to slowly provide for their families again, and at least start to feel like we're recovering and getting better. The much more famous than the Civil Works Administration was the Public Works Administration. This was run by Harold Ickes, another really famous member of Roosevelt's cabinet. $4 billion. I mean, we're talking billions and billions of dollars of debt we're going to go into in order to fund this. Was spent to, again, build 34,000 different works projects. Those are infrastructure projects. Roads, bridges, railroads, anything that needed to get built. Because, hey, if we build those projects that are waiting to get funded, that means every project is going to be hiring workers, and that means people back to work, and that's going to stimulate the economy. And when we build roads and bridges, we've got to order pavement and steel, and that's going to help those industries. And so the idea here is, when the private businesses, when industries are struggling, when we're in a depression, the government needs to step in, FDR says, and go into debt if necessary to fund things to put people to work, to get them back to work again until private business recovers and is able to hire them and put them back to work again on its own. Anyways, Harold Ickes, $4 billion, 34,000 projects, although sometimes he held on to more money than he needed to. The most famous works job of all, in the cities at least, was this, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. 9 million people, public projects, bridges, roads, airports, schools, hospitals, whatever needed to be built, $11 billion. Almost 40% of the entire workforce in the United States at one point was funded by this. That's absurd. So again, during this time, it's almost like socialism to a certain extent. With these programs, we're either running or funding many of them. Part of the WPA was something called the Federal Arts Project. Actors, artists, musicians, writers were hired to go out and produce materials. Many of them were supposed to document what was happening during the Depression. The idea was, one, you could hire these folks, you could put them to work. Two, they would do a great job of chronicling it, of documenting it, of bringing like life and emotion to it and telling people stories to kind of try to unify the country to try to defeat it. All right, so all of this is designed to help unify the country, unite the country, get each other to support each other a little more, and to end this depression as quickly as possible. So here we have A Christmas Carol. Here we have Noah, a comedy about the Ark. These are plays that are being performed during the Depression in order to kind of try to, make people feel a little sense of normalcy, and also to put some folks back to work. The National Youth Administration. Hey, a big problem was a lot of college students and high school students were having to drop out to try to find jobs to help their parents because they'd lost their jobs. And this actually focused on putting high school and college kids to work in part-time jobs so they wouldn't have to drop out of school, so that we can get them educated and they can help us to recover in the future even more. Anyways, I'm going to jump over all of this. Here we go. I want to go to this slide, actually. This is the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate skyrocketing when FDR takes over, and you see how it starts to go down big time. So it looks like his plan is, if it's working, it's definitely reducing unemployment, and it looks like the worst of the Depression has been stopped by the New Deal, and we're starting to recover. Now you'll notice at one point it starts to get worse again. That's because he makes a mistake. But the moral of the New Deal is it doesn't end the Depression, right? It doesn't come close to ending it. What it does is it stops the worst effects of the Depression at a time when we desperately need it. It starts to get us to recover. But look, it's the blue part of this line. It's the World War II that really is going to be what gets us back to unemployment levels, that are actually lower than they were before the Depression hit. So we like to say the New Deal stopped the worst parts of the Depression. World War II is what fully allowed us to recover and get out of the effects of the Depression. This is a really famous image, African Americans in an unemployment line, waiting for assistance, standing in front of a billboard that was bragging from the 1920s about how wealthy and rich all Americans were, how we had the world's highest standard of living, how there was no way like the American way. Look at that happy family in the billboard. Meanwhile, by the 1930s, here we are in the Depression, living in misery. The entire nation is devastated. The other programs designed to help fix some of the problems, the AAA, the Agricultural Administration Adjustment Administration, known as the AAA. The idea here is we're going to try to help farms and farmers out to try to stop these farm closures. We gave subsidies, which are payments by the government to farmers. One, we would pay farmers to grow certain crops to try to eliminate extra surplus. So if we had too much grain, we would pay farmers to grow other crops. Even if they didn't make as much as they did before, we would pay them the difference. We would also pay them sometimes to buy their crops so that we could destroy them. The goal was to destroy the excess supply, to try to bring prices back up. Now that's viewed as kind of heartless. Think about this. We're in the midst of the Depression. People are starving. They're malnourished. We have all this extra food. What the government does is they buy some of this food from farmers, and instead of handing it out to people, they destroy it. Because if they hand it out, we're still going to have too much of a supply and not enough demand. And so they have to kind of get rid of it. This meant they also slaughtered millions of pigs. They destroyed millions of acres of agriculture. They paid farmers not to grow crops sometimes. So this was a little bit of a controversial program. Anyways, the result of this was it actually slowly started to help. It looked like this would actually help farmers, but eventually the Supreme Court stepped in. It was very conservative during the New Deal, and it did overturn this policy, saying it was unconstitutional. FDR did also work with Congress to pass a couple of other laws designed to help farmers, including the Federal Farm Loan Act, which gave millions of dollars out to farmers so they could keep their farms open. And boy, did they need it, because the 1930s was the era where the farmers were destroyed by an environmental event known as the Dust Bowl. Drought struck the Midwest of the United States, the area known as the Great Plains, at a time when the Depression was also ravaging the country. Because farmers were so desperate to try to survive, they were producing too much, and they were overproducing, and they were damaging that topsoil, the soil they were growing their crops on. And so when the drought hit, and then windstorms would occur occasionally, the windstorms would pick up that topsoil, and they would create massive dust storms. It would lead to the desertification of cropland, which meant cropland would go very barren, and much of the fertile topsoil would be picked up and spread all over. So you would end up with these crazy dust storms that would leave massive piles of dust and topsoil spread everywhere. Again, look at these images, just absurd. Look at that, just buried in dust. Anyways, lots of pristine farmland was destroyed by this. And so it was partly human-caused, it was partly environmentally caused by the droughts. And so anyways, about 350,000 of these farmers lost everything. They had to move to California and other places looking for work. They were known as Okies or Arkies because many of them had fled from Oklahoma and Arkansas. Again, farmers really struggled in the 20s and 30s, and that struggle really continues on afterwards as well. Anyways, the government did try to help them. The government passed policies to try to prevent bankruptcies of farms. They passed the Resettlement Administration to try to help them relocate. So can you see that FDR is really, the idea here is to create massive numbers of programs. Some are going to be successful, many will be failures. He says, let's try them all, let's see what works, we'll get rid of the ones that don't, and if anything, the public's going to think, and we're doing as much as we possibly can to help them. which is good for us one way or the other. Anyways, you should know The Grapes of Wrath. The famous book by John Steinbeck is the story of those Okies and Arkies during the Dust Bowl. If you haven't read it, you should, and you probably will next year. A couple of other things. In order to put people back to work even further, we do start to bring electricity and power lines to rural parts of the country. It was known as the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA. In addition to that, folks, we've got the National Industrial Recovery Administration. So now we focus on industry and labor. Do you see how he's tackling each of these problems differently? So he says, hey, we need to fix industry. We need to get it producing again to like it was before the war started. I should say before the Depression started. And so what he did is he created a group known as the NIRA. They had a board that was made up of labor and business and industry leaders. 200 of them, and they created these codes, these rules that workers and businesses would agree to. It set maximum work hours, it set minimum wages, it would actually set minimum prices, it would set limits and quotas as to how much could be produced. All of this was designed to help the economy, industry recover after the war. I said it again, after the Depression. The government suspended antitrust laws, so they actually allowed businesses to come together during the Depression in order to try to help us get out of it that much further. At the same time, workers were actually guaranteed collective bargaining by the government for one of the first times. And anti-union contracts, known as yellow dog contracts, were forbidden. So that you were never denied the right to join a union from this point forward. Also, during the New Deal, child labor is going to be officially ended in this country once and for all, after it had been overturned by the courts previously. Anyways, as you can see, this is an image where Uncle Sam is trying to get through the door to get us out of the Depression. And you'll see a worker, a laborer, is blocking the way. The message here is by a cartoonist who's worried that laborers, if they go on strike, are going to slow down our recovery. What do you think, Kenny Bear? You're kind of loud over here all of a sudden. So the message here is workers need to do their part and help us to get out of this Depression by not going on strike and by agreeing to the NIRA's rules. In addition to the NIRA, we created the NRA. Now, hey, the whole purpose of the NRA, it's not the National Rifle Association, by the way. It's called the National Recovery Administration. The whole purpose was to advertise and sell the rules that had just been agreed to by the NIRA board. So, if you were a business that was following these rules and doing your part to help us recover, you put this sign in your window that was the blue eagle of the NRA that told people, hey, I'm a business that's doing my part. You should shop here. You should give me preference because I'm doing everything I can to help us recover. Businesses do improve from this generally. The NRA was also overturned, or parts of it were overturned, by the Supreme Court as well. I told you it was a conservative court, just like it had been during the 20s. Famous law that is passed during FDR's presidency, one of the most famous labor laws in history. It's known as the National Labor Relations Act, also the Wagner Act, two names for the same law. Probably one of the most famous. It gave labor unions the right to collectively bargain once and for all. It not only protected the AFL, the Skilled Workers Union, it allowed for the first time the creation of the unskilled union, the CIO. That's the Congress of Industrial Organizations. It's known as the CIO. It becomes our largest unskilled union. Today we have the AFL and the CIO, our two largest unions, and the CIO is created as part of the Wagner Act. Anyways, huge step forward for labor. We're going to start to see millions and millions of people join unions for the first time. We also get the Fair Labor Standards Act. That sets minimum wages. It sets 40-hour work weeks. It ends child labor. Again, it makes workers and labor unions big supporters of the Democrats and FDR from that point forward. Again, look at this. Look at during FDR's presidency, what you're going to see, huge jumps in union membership. Then notice, after his presidency, it's going to start to go down, and that's continued all the way up till today. Hey, a couple of other programs by FDR, the Tennessee Valley Authority. The TVA public program, we bring power and utility companies by building dams throughout the country. So we went to rivers and lakes, we built dams, we used the water power from those to create power plants that brought electricity throughout the country to the south. So this was massively important. We built 20 massive dams, which puts millions of people to work. Oh, by the way, we're bringing power and development to places that didn't have it. Huge successes. Cheap power, low-cost housing develops now in places where it didn't exist before because now there's power. Reforestation happens when we build some of these dams, and flood control, so no more flooding in some areas. And anyways, it's a huge success, all right? The FHA, housing, we give loans to homeowners so they can stay in their homes, and we create a government organization to do so. We also make it easier for new-time buyers to buy their home for the first time. So this is big for homeowners. And again, we did the same thing with something called the USHA, which was another program to help first-time buyers. Probably our biggest reform program of all time is this, the Social Security Act, and boy, do you need to know it. It is one of the farthest reaching. It's one of the most important. It's still around today. It's one of the most controversial. It gave federal and state unemployment insurance, first off. So if you're unemployed and it's not your own doing, you'll get payments from the government for part of that that you also pay into through part of your paycheck every week while you are working. It also gives pensions for retirees. When you reach a certain age, the government's going to give you a monthly pension. Of course, you pay into that pension throughout your life and every paycheck. But once you reach a certain age, you're entitled to a monthly payment from the government. My mom receives Social Security. She receives about $1,500 a month from the government. But every person above that age technically is entitled to it, or most people. Again, how does this all get paid for? It gets paid for by a payroll tax, so everybody gets pays into this account, and then when you reach a certain age, you get to collect from it. It also funds something called AFDC, which is designed to help families that are struggling. It's sometimes called welfare. It also provided funding to the blind, to the handicapped, to delinquent children, other dependents, people with delinquent children. And other dependents. The whole goal here is to try to provide safety nets, security nets, because so many people had been harmed by the Depression. Many of them are people that are most susceptible, are poorest, are ones that are least able to survive. And so we want to create these to help old folks, to help poorer folks to recover and have a safety net to help catch them. The government's going to provide that. Also, the Revenue Act, we're going to raise income taxes on the highest incomes, obviously, to help try to pay for many of these programs. This reversed a lot of the tax cuts that had existed before as well. So conservative Republicans tend to support trickle-down tax cuts. Liberal Democrats tend to support, more spending, and so therefore higher tax rates, especially on the wealthy. During the New Deal, FDR and Congress also finally got rid of the Dawes Severalty Act. They finally gave Native Americans control of their lands back. They recognized tribal constitutions. They recognized tribal governments. They gave them some sovereignty over their lands. They are dependent nations and part of the United States, but within those lands, they have a lot of their own sovereignty, a lot of their own legal power. It did allow them to fully express their culture again. We finally got rid of that stupid Dawes Act that had destroyed Native American cultures previously. Effects of the first New Deal. Well, again, the U.S. economy improved. It never fully recovered from the effects of the Depression. But we do improve in pretty much every way. We produce more. We make more money. Our wages go up. Farms go up. Banks and money supply go up. Unemployment went down. But you could make the argument, hey, we're still way behind where we needed to be, and way behind where we were before the Depression. So one could argue, hey, maybe this wasn't as much of a success. It's really up to how you want to analyze it. Critics, there were plenty of people who had problems with FDR and with his handling of the New Deal. A lot of these folks were critical of what they called false promises, things they claimed he had not followed through on. So, let's get to it. All right, critics of the New Deal. Well, the first are conservative critics, wealthy Republicans, obviously. They thought he was a socialist. They thought that he was giving way too much power to the government. These programs were taking powers away from business and private companies. So they thought he was socialist. They tried to defeat him in elections. They were very unsuccessful. He was so popular with the public. Another critic was a guy that was a famous Catholic priest. He had a radio show. His name was Father Charles Coughlin. He was critical that FDR didn't do enough. He thought that he should take the banks over and distribute wealth to those that were most in need through the banks. When FDR did not do that, Father Coughlin criticized him. Now, hey, this was a big deal because Coughlin was so popular, but here's where it gets weird. Coughlin kind of got weird during the Depression, and he started to use like anti-Semitism in his messages. He started to talk about how he supported fascism and Hitler and Mussolini. And eventually his radio show got canceled because he was saying such crazy things. Anyways, an early famous critic of FDR, probably the most famous critic of FDR, was a guy named Huey Long. His nickname was the Kingfish. He was a really famous Southern Democrat politician. He would say wild, crazy things. He lived wild, kind of crazy life. His big plan was called Share Our Wealth. He was going to take $5,000 by taxing the wealthy, and he was going to give $5,000 to every family in this country by taxing the rich to take and give to the poor. He was very popular in Louisiana, and he was popular with the public. He would have been a challenger to FDR in 1936. However, he was assassinated under really shady circumstances. It had to do supposedly with an affair that he was involved in. Another really famous critic of FDR, Dr. Francis Townsend. Now, his criticism is, and by the way, Huey Long's criticism is FDR didn't do enough. That sharing our wealth was what the country needed, and that FDR's programs didn't go far enough. So Coughlin, Long, and now this guy, Townsend, are going to say FDR's programs didn't go far enough. Meanwhile, conservatives, the American Liberty League, is like, crazy, FDR is going way too far. He's turning us into this communist-like socialist state. Anyways, Townsend was representing old people. He was old himself. He was a doctor. And he argued that FDR wasn't doing enough to help old people, that they were struggling. They were the ones that couldn't provide for themselves, and they were struggling more than other groups were, and FDR had forgotten about them. So because of that criticism, FDR actually supported Social Security Act. He got it passed to help old people, to provide that pension, largely because he wanted to silence or stop this criticism from Townsend. Anyways, remember, the second half of FDR's presidency here during the Depression is known as the Second New Deal. This is when he starts to move more towards the reform programs, the Works Progress Administration, the National Youth Association, the REA, the Royal Electrification Administration, the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Social Security Act, the Revenue Act. Those are all programs from this time. During the 1936, he did win re-election. He wins by a landslide, in one of the biggest landslides in history, 523 to 8. It shows you just how popular he is. Look at that electoral map. My goodness. Now, finally, FDR clashed with the Supreme Court a lot. They were really conservative. They shot down some of his New Deal programs. They were really the only thing standing in the way of him and his success during this time. And so he kind of went to war with them. It didn't go well for him. So the courts overturned, for instance, part of the NRA. They then later overturned part of the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Now, they overturned them on kind of technicalities, but they basically said FDR had gone too far and had taken powers that he should not have as president. They should belong to other branches. Anyways, in response to that, FDR did something called, he tried to pack the court. What that meant was he got the Judiciary Reorganization Bill passed. It said any judge that was over 70 years old had to retire, and FDR got to replace the president got to replace him with a new one. And if the judge refused to retire, then the president got to appoint a new judge. On top of the current number, he got to add a judge to the court. Now, the whole goal here was to get rid of these old conservative judges. Everybody knew it. And these were the guys that were blocking FDR's policies and plans. And so this was clearly an effort by FDR to try to, influence the court to make it support him. So this was a famous criticism where the court is being replaced by a bunch of FDR lookalikes in the background. And it's kind of criticizing what FDR is doing here in packing the court. Anyways, that's what his critics argued. They argued he was packing the court, which meant he was filling it with liberals that agreed with him, and he was basically trying to manipulate the government in order to do so. It seemed like he was violating checks and balances, because he kind of was. He was trying to influence the court too much. Ultimately, this bill, his Judiciary Reorganization Act, was actually defeated, and it was one of the big blows he had during the New Deal. And in some ways, it sort of starts to mark the end or the slowdown of the New Deal. The other major reason why the New Deal slowed down was because we had a little recession. At one point, FDR thought we were doing a lot better. He thought the New Deal had worked and that the Depression was kind of ending. And so he stopped. He stopped funding some of those programs. And so he said, hey, we can start to pay back some of our debt now. Well, when that happened, we slipped right back into a depression again. That's what happens right here with the unemployment when it started to go up again. And so we had to go right back to the New Deal policies. We had to borrow money again. By the way, that policy where you borrow money during tough times to help business out is known as Keynesian economics. But anyways, during that recession, there was a midterm election, and the Democrats lost a bunch of seats in Congress. It was clear the public was starting to pay more attention to the war. They were starting to lose interest in the New Deal, and it was losing support and momentum as well. So anyways, criticisms of the New Deal, maybe it didn't solve the Depression. It did make the federal government huge. States suffered. They lost a lot of power. The national debt doubled during the Great Depression under the New Deal. Those who support it, FDR also packed the court, right? Remember, so those who support it would argue, hey, it might have saved capitalism because it kind of kept the worst parts of the Depression from hurting us even worse. He kind of brought the nation back again. It relieved the worst of our problems, they say. And a lot of those reforms still exist today, right? So anyways, it doesn't really matter what I think. You could make an argument one way or the other. Remember, New Deal is really just an extension of a lot of the progressive reforms that had been proposed earlier. This is Mr. M. I'm signing out. All right, I hope this was good for you. Thanks for sticking along.